Hi, welcome to Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is a sermon for the 10th week of Pentecost, if you follow the liturgical calendar. The reading I'm going to focus on is Luke 12, verses 49 through 56, but there's also a poignant poem entitled How It Worked by Jeffrey Harrison. You can look that up, and it's pretty good. So just like we get tired of bad news from the news media, at least I do, I'm sure that you are like me and you get tired of bad news from the Sunday lectionary readings, because we've been getting a lot the last many weeks of summer. And the punchline to Isaiah this morning is God expected justice but saw bloodshed, righteousness but heard a cry. Now there's a pun of sorts in here, but because we don't read ancient Hebrew, which I don't either, we don't always catch it. There's a one-letter difference between the word for justice and bloodshed. One letter. It's mishpat versus mishpah. And between the words righteousness and cries, also a one-letter difference. I mention it only because I've bragged about Isaiah the poet before, and that's some of the wordplay that he often employs. Anyway, this doggone bit from Isaiah begins like a love song to a lover that quickly changes key. It's all about God's outrage at God's lover, Israel. The vintner, a metaphor for God, did everything he could to raise the choicest, the loveliest, the most exquisite, flavorful grapes, only to discover that they were moldy, smelly, rotten, and foul. In a fit of rage, the vintner plows asunder the vineyard, tears down the protecting hedge, and turns it back to nature. And I say, bravo! We could use a little more turning back to nature, if you ask me. So it's a good thing I'm not God. Then there is that painful Jeffrey Harrison poem, How It Worked. I'm sure all of us had some parental trigger when we felt slighted or betrayed or disfavored by one of our parents or grandparents who treated a sibling better. I never knew any of my grandparents, and both of my parents were only children, so I didn't really have aunts and uncles. But I did have a great aunt, Aunt Elma, and she was a gem. But she didn't hesitate demonstrating favoritism towards me. For example, she took me out every year of my birthday when until I was in high school. And she bought me whatever I wanted, usually more than one thing. Like one year I got an alligator, another year I got a white mouse. My mom just went nuts. I don't think she did that with my sisters, so maybe that sowed some resentment. Anyway, the poem is a view kind of from the other side of the playing field from Isaiah, where we only hear about God's outrage. The poem voices the hurt and the anger from a son who feels rejected. Now, we do not have Israel's voice in this poem from Isaiah, but if we did, it might sound like Harrison's poem. Or the voices of the Ammonites or the Hittites or the Jebusites, who were Israel's neighbors and might have worked up some jealous rage too, had they known Yahweh. Then along comes Jesus in Luke. Clearly, he's not happy to be playing the role of fire-breathing prophet, sowing division between those who should be at peace with one another. But it isn't really him swinging a weapon. Rather, it is simple cause and effect. He's come, he says elsewhere, to share a vision for how to create the kingdom on earth as it is, or as we imagine it is, in heaven. So just holding up that vision is going to piss some people off. Excuse my crude saying. Or as Harry Truman famously retorted when someone told him to give him hell, Harry, I told him the truth and they thought it was hell. Just putting it out there, the vision, creates division. And if it gores our ox or calls our baby ugly, we get angry. If it's someone we care about or whose affirmation we deeply desire that is giving us a vision that is somehow alienating or disturbing, who's telling us something we don't want to hear, then we get hurt and angry and outraged. Look out. All of which is to say, what has been caricatured by many people these days, and for some time, and because it's been taught this way too, erroneously, the caricature of an angry, vengeful Old Testament God versus a loving, gentle New Testament God. All of that's horsepucky. In each testament, God and the prophets of God describe the causes and warn against the effects. If we live this way, then this will happen. If we live that way, then that will happen. Cause and effect. Now, that's not to say there wasn't some bit of smiting going on in the first few books of the Bible and the threat of smiting in the apocryphal New Testament verses. But both of those are the exception, not the rule. I don't ascribe to those any more than most of you do. But what we often hear as God, or the prophets of God, as threatening to rain down doom and destruction upon us, is actually a warning rather than a threat. A warning rather than a threat. They are descriptions of what will happen if we continue to live in particular ways. You may know that I am a recovering alcoholic, and for better or worse, that experience and the 12 steps are a primary lens for me. I've estimated it was about 8 years from the first time somebody warned me about the consequences of my continuing to drink so heavily and use drugs enthusiastically, and when I finally acknowledged that I was powerless before alcohol. It was only then, when I acknowledged my powerlessness, that and accepted the reality of the reckless and debilitating cause and effect of my choices, it was only then that I felt God enter the scene and nurture my recovery. I had prophets in my life, but I ignored them, and God wasn't going to save me from my resistance. The ancient texts of biblical wisdom are like that as well. The promise that our actions have consequences, and God isn't here to save us from ourselves. Giving us prophets, warnings, poetic and metaphorical descriptions of the causes and the effects is what God does in the biblical text. The rest is up to us. The rest is up to us. The laments and the stories are not God warning us that if we don't shape up, it's God, if we don't shape up, that God is warning that it's the laments and the stories are not God warning us that God is going to punish us with doom and destruction. Rather, it's a description of the cosmos, really, that the cosmos is an intricate ecosystem and operates upon interdependence. So our actions have consequences all up and down the line. Climate change is the perfect metaphor and reality of what Isaiah and Jesus are up to in the readings we heard today. There have been people warning us for a century now, if not more, about what would happen if we keep doing what we're doing. There are consequences to how we live. Whether it's draining the Colorado River with an insatiable straw or pumping plastic into our water, No one is going to save us from the consequences of our actions other than us. God and the prophets of God have been giving us a heads up for several millennia. The sword Jesus brings is wisdom, not a cleaver. The wisdom is how to live in such a way that we can create the kingdom on earth as we imagine it is in heaven. How to live in such a way as to avoid the consequences that we dread. So biblical images and stories and prophecies of doom and destruction are easily lampooned in our more intellectually sophisticated culture of the 21st century. But the joke is on us, because we don't recognize the sublime wisdom that is actually held within these ancient poems and stories. They're really just warnings that we will live with the consequences of our actions. And there's no fairy godmother or godfather who will arrive at the critical moment and save us from ourselves. But, and this is critical, we have the wisdom we need in order to change the trajectory and to create a more life-giving place on earth as it is in heaven. Having the wisdom we need in order to do what we need to do to create the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven is indeed good news. That's all I got today. It's really good news, described, hidden by other things. So thank you for being part of this. I wish you a great deal of peace.